Well, I say good morning to our friends at the two theater campus churches. Let's welcome them right now. We are in week 2 of our process through 2020 Vision Better Together. And it occurred to me that I ought to just remind you, if you will. If you haven't picked up a brochure, we have these at the back in each of your settings. Also, the prayer tent looks like this. We hope that you have this someplace. I've been at many of your homes, and I've seen them in your uh, kitchen counter or the kitchen table or someplace like that. And then last weekend, we made available to you a free copy of The Treasure Principle by Randy Alcorn. Let me see your hands there in the theaters. How many have started reading this? It's a pretty powerful book, isn't it? It's very good. So if you haven't picked them up, we encourage you to do that yet this weekend. As I said, we're on part 2 of our campaign series. I really hope that this campaign is going to be more of a spiritual life, spiritual growth campaign than a capital funds campaign, if you will. And we're looking today at what to expect when you move from here to there, and subtitled, There's Always an Obstacle. Isn't that the truth? To do that, I wanted to look at, kind of give you a little history lesson or a reminder of something that occurred right around 500 years before Christ, a long time ago. So we're looking at roughly 2,500 years ago. Um, a year ago now, we were in the story. Remember when we did the story? And we looked from Genesis through Revelation, and we talked about God's upper story and how that intersects with our lower story. And that's very much what we're talking about as we look at this historical overview of Ezra and his day. Um, so this is both intended to be a refresher course on Bible history, if you will, but also a personal application. I hope that there's enough uh, junctures or intersections with this history that relate to you as well. Um, so a key passage, our memory passage this week is 3 verses from Jeremiah 29:11. Would you read those with me now? For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. Then you will call upon me and pray to me, and I will hear you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. You have in your notes, right below that key passage, uh, what they call a bell curve, or sometimes it's called other things in statistics, but it's a pretty common phenomenon for history or for statistics or data to fall along the lines of this curve. And so, to give you a little bit of a historical background, um, I believe that that bell curve could be applied to many aspects of biblical history, where the people start and they have a great opportunity and they're optimistic, and then they hit the obstacles and they either give up or they climb to the top of the hill, and then it's coasting for a bit, going downhill in victory and overcoming. And prior to the time of Ezra, I think about Joseph and how he allowed his family to come and live with him in Egypt, and they peeked out and they just had a great time with Joseph in Egypt. And then the Bible tells us there were pharaohs or kings that came along that didn't remember Joseph, and so they went down into the pits. And then Moses comes along, and God raises up Moses, and they have this opportunity to be freed from slavery in Egypt to the promised land. And through that time, God speaks through Moses and many of the prophets that we have in the Old Testament and warns them that not to take this success for granted, that they need to heed God's commands. And so, do they do that? No, not over the long haul. But we go from Moses, and Moses right around 1,500 years before Christ. And then he leads them from slavery, and David lived right around 1,000 years before Christ. And the peak of the curve was when David was king, and then followed by David was Solomon, and Solomon was pretty good at least at first, but then he kind of fell by the wayside as he went along. Solomon died in 930 BC, so about 930 years before Jesus was born. And once Solomon died, the nation of Israel began to fall apart. There were 12 tribes. 10 of the 12 tribes were called the North, northern Israel, and they were the first to go. In fact, the Assyrian Empire overtook them and took them into slavery, and they shipped them, they deported them, they exiled them all around the known world at that time. That was it. These dates aren't huge, whether you remember them or not, but 722 BC is when the northern kingdom, when those 10 tribes of Israel fell to Assyria. Then, after Assyria came Babylon, and the Babylonian Empire, incidentally, that would be equivalent to Iraq today. They came into dominance, and it was during the time of Babylon that Jerusalem fell. Jerusalem, the remaining two tribes were Judah and Benjamin, and those two tribes fell, and Jerusalem was totally devastated, and the temple was destroyed, and there was all kinds of rubble. It was just a mess after Babylon took them down. And just before those verses that I had you read, Jeremiah 29:11 is a classic that Christians like to quote. Verse 10 gives you some context that I don't think we even think about very often. But Jeremiah 29:10, Jeremiah says, "This is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place." That's when he goes into, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord." So verse 10, he's saying, 586, you're going to be destroyed. 70 years from 586, you're going to be back again. And so that's the verse that predicts what's going to happen in Ezra's day. So when 70 years are completed in Babylon, God is going to allow them to rebuild the temple. They're going to get another chance, if you will. But the bell curve has gone all the way down, and now they're having to start over again, if you will. As I said, this has personal application. If you ever had a time in your life when things were going pretty good and you took it for granted and you failed and you fell and you had to start over again, every great challenge begins with an opportunity, and this is the opportunity that Ezra and the people had. So there's a few words to write in your notes today. I'll give you a hint. If you look at the bell curve, all those words are right there. The first one is opportunity. Opportunity means hearing the knock. And in Ezra chapters 1 and 2, they're feeling the sense of God knocking on their door with opportunity. I happened to do a little Google search on the word knocking, opportunity knocking, and I came up with a couple statements. One of them says, "Opportunity knocks only once. You never know if you'll get another opportunity." And then another one says, "If somebody offers you an amazing opportunity, but you're not sure you can do it, say yes anyway, then learn how to do it later." Another one says, "Opportunity does not waste time with those who are not prepared." And then the final one, "Opportunity will come and go, but if you do nothing about them, so will you." So we're called to open the door when the opportunity comes, and that's the exciting thing that we sense in Ezra chapter 1. It says there, "In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia." Now, I didn't explain to you that after Babylon, who took down Jerusalem, it changed to Persia, and Persian Empire was next. This is chasing a rabbit. Alexander the Great, that whole thing there. King of Persia, Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the word that we just read, "I have a plan for you to do good and not harm," the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus to make a proclamation. "The Lord, the God of heaven, has appointed me," that is Cyrus, "to build a temple for him at Jerusalem in Judah. Anyone of his people, let him go to Jerusalem." Let the Lord's people go back to Jerusalem. Interestingly enough, if you were to look at Isaiah 45, I think it is, Isaiah predicts that there'll be a king named Cyrus that's going to come and allow the people to come back home to their land. So what an opportunity, what a miracle that was for them. And then it tells us in chapter 2, when they arrived at the house of the Lord in Jerusalem, some heads of families gave free will offerings toward the rebuilding of the house of God on its site. According to their ability, they gave to the treasury for this work gold, silver, garments. They were just stoked. They're so excited about what's happening, and they gave freely to help that rebuilding of the temple occur. The opportunity was so great. It looked so good that naturally included the second phenomenon there of optimism. Write that down if you haven't written it already. Optimism, the initial thrill of hope that we read about in Ezra chapter 3. When the 7th month came and the Israelites had settled in their towns, the people assembled as one man in Jerusalem. Then Yeshua and his fellow priests and Zerubbabel and his associates began to build the altar of the God of Israel. They began to offer burnt offerings to the Lord, though the foundation of the Lord's temple had not yet been laid. They're just so excited. They're having an open-air worship. They got the altar built, and you see this combination of Yeshua, the religious leaders, the priests, along with Zerubbabel, who was the governor under the authority of Persia, but the church and state, if you will, they're working together to rebuild at least the altar. They hadn't even finished the foundation for the temple, but they can't wait. They're so excited, optimistic about the future. And it says in chapter 3, verse 11, all the people gave a great shout of praise to the Lord because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. They went on to build the foundation. They continue their excitement and their optimism. It was a great beginning. They've rolled up their sleeves. They've gotten to work. They're just fired up. Yet the real hard work is yet to begin. They're in the honeymoon era, if you will. You know, you ever been there? The easy start. Everybody loves you. Everything's going your way. You're on the road to success until the next stage comes. And that is the stage that I hate to remind you about. You know already, that's the obstacles. You can't expect you're going to skip over obstacles. Somebody said it's those obstacles that give us footholds to climb the hill, that give us traction. So the inevitable opposition of obstacles. These three that I list here, there's a whole bunch of D words. These all start with D. I could have thought of a whole bunch of other ones, I think. First of all is the enemy's deception. Ezra 4, 1 and 2. When the enemies of Judah and Benjamin heard that the exiles were building a temple for the Lord, the God of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel and to the heads of the families and said, let us help you build, because like you, we seek your God. You know, liar, liar, phony, but they're just trying to deceive them and to kind of slip into the ranks. And that can happen so easily, in that kind of a mild form of deception. But then it goes, when that didn't work, they increased the pressure. So there's next personal discouragement. Then the peoples around them set out to discourage the people of Judah, to make them afraid to go on building. They hired counselors to work against them. How can we conspire against these folks? We've got to get them discouraged. We've got to get them to give up. You know, there's been so much controversy in the news in the last couple of years about the presidential election of 2016. And I'm beginning to figure out that it wasn't just collusion from Russia with Trump, but Russia was playing both sides against the middle. They're playing with Hillary Clinton, too. Their desire is just to mess things up, just to confuse things, to bring down the morale of the United States of America. Jesus understood that about the enemy of our souls when he said in John 10, the thief comes to steal and kill and destroy, but I have come that you may have life and life more abundantly. So the enemy is always trying to destroy and discourage and get you down and get you to quit. Anybody ever have experience like that? Now, if you allow me to venture toward politics again, I don't think it's just Russia, but I think China, Iran, Venezuela, they're suspecting might have something to do with these hordes of people that are going up through Mexico right now. They're just trying to disrupt and discourage and bring dishearten the people when people are making progress. So then we see that the progress got delayed. It came, in fact, to a dead stop. At the beginning of the reign of Xerxes, which was yet another leader of Persia, they lodged an accusation against the people of Judah and Jerusalem and compelled them by force to stop. Thus, the work on the house of God in Jerusalem came to a standstill. They've been going great guns, and then all the opposition comes, and now they've had to stop. How frustrating that must have been. And they stopped, it tells us, for 16 years they stopped. Can you imagine just putting everything on hold? 16 years, what are we, 2018, add 16, 2034, we'll get started again, Take heart, it's only going to be another 16 years. But that's inertia. They've lost all their momentum. I was struck years ago when I read that a 1-inch block of wood placed in front of the drive wheel of a very powerful locomotive will keep the locomotive from ever starting. Once that powerful locomotive is moving, you couldn't stop it with a brick wall. But it doesn't take much. Once the inertia has set in, you don't have any momentum. And so that's happened to them. So what do? They work on their own homes. Well, we're going to have a nice house. Maybe the Lord's house is going to sit in ruins, sit partially done, but we're going to take care of our own, we're going to, so, maybe the Lord's house isn't so important, but what can I do? Am I starting to apply this to our campaign? What can I do, for my own welfare? When I first came to Penn Ave Church, I remember that first year trying to interest a young guy to come and help with the yard work at church. And he said, well, I would, but I got yard work at home to do. I really can't see myself coming over to help cut the grass at church, And so he didn't have any vision for God's work. It was all about him. Well, that's the way it was in Ezra's day as well. They lost sight of the vision. They lost their enthusiasm, their optimism of the opportunity God had given them, and they focused on their own needs instead of God's needs. I think of how that applies in my experience to winter driving. A couple of winters ago, I stayed at our place at the lake, and I didn't realize there was snow coming overnight. And we got maybe just an inch of snow. But I got up in the morning, and I had to get up this hill, and the hill not only goes up quite a severe grade, but it curves part way up. And I tried my little Toyota to get as much head start as I could, and I'd be revved up, but I'd hit that little curve, and I finally had to take a snow shovel and shovel paths for each wheel to go up the rest of the way up the hill because it wasn't going to make it any other way. Maybe you've been in that kind of a condition. People in New York State know what it is to drive in the winter. You know that you don't gain anything by just spinning the tires more and more. You got to get traction. And if you get a little bit of traction, don't hit the gas too hard, but just keep that little bit of ability to creep against the slippery condition. Well, they lost all traction. They were stuck there for all those years. Now, time out for personal application. Has this ever happened to you? Where you felt this opportunity, you felt God's call on your life, and then you say, well, God, you let me down. Or why God? And if you look back honestly, what really was going on? When that happens to me, I look back and I say, I think that was God trying to teach me a lesson, that I needed to keep my focus where it was supposed to be. How does that apply to you, whether it's your job or your career or your finances or your spiritual life or your relationships or friendships with other people? Some kind of big project, some kind of a spiritual project, a temple-like project in your life? What's happened in your experience? So when these things happen, we have three choices, three options. One is to get overrun by the challenge and just give up the dream. You come to a dead stop, and the rest of your life you just kind of exist, but you're not going anywhere. Or number two, you get sidetracked and you compromise and you pursue a lesser dream. Or three, you, with God's help, get determination and focus on God and overcome the challenge. Begin to make headway again. So we see the impact of opportunity and optimism giving way to obstacles. And then fourth is from the top of that bell curve down, called overcoming, conquering the obstacles. And we see there's 4 principles here involved in conquering obstacles, and we see them in Ezra chapters 5 and 6. First of all, remember the Creator who created the opportunity in the first place. Don't forget who provided the opportunity. In verses 1 and 2 of chapter 5, now Haggai, who is one of our prophets in the Old Testament, and Zechariah, another one, these prophets prophesied in the name of the God of Israel. Then Zerubbabel and Yeshua set to work to rebuild the house of God in Jerusalem, and the prophets of God were with them, helping them. They're getting traction again. They're getting beyond stuck to going forward. As I mentioned, the governor, the political leader, and the spiritual leader are teamed together. So when you need traction, think back to who created the opportunity. When you're struggling, remember that it was God who led you to marry that person in the first place. You don't just give up. Remember that it was God who gave you the job. You don't just quit. Remember that it was God who helped you start that friendship or that relationship. What can you do to restore the relationship? Remember that it was God who opened the door of opportunity so that you have a longer picture, a longer view of what God might be doing. Obstacles tend to divide us and pull us apart. They tend to isolate us, and that's what the enemy loves. That's what the enemy of the United States would do, is to get us divided and pulling against each other. And boy, it seems to be working. Have we ever been any more polarized, where there's polar opposites against each other? Our enemy's winning when that happens. In the church, the enemy wins when that happens. A campaign like this can unite us or divide us, depending on which way we go. I really believe strongly, as we've been saying, we are better together. Would you say that with me? We are better together. And Jesus prayed that we would be together. He prayed in John 17, I pray that they may be one, that the world may know that I, Jesus, was sent of the Father. So we're called to unity and to be better together. So remember the Creator who created the opportunity. And number 2, wait with active patience for a breakthrough, with anticipation. Active patience is the opposite of passive surrender or acquiescence. Oh, what will be, I'll just let it be, and acceptance without protest. But to go down fighting, if you will, to have that determination. We see in chapter 5, verse 17, now if it pleases the king, what patience you see there, let a search be made in the royal archives of Babylon to see if King Cyrus did in fact issue a decree to rebuild this house of God in Jerusalem. Then let the king send us his decision in this matter. What patience it took to say, listen, you bozos, King Cyrus told us we could do this, but he humbly says, if it pleased the king, go back and look through the records. And imagine, they've changed empires. They've changed all this stuff, all the different personnel. It's even worse than going back from the Trump administration back to the Obama administration to find some records. This is huge change, but it took patience to wait for that to happen. But indeed, when they waited, God honored that, and it did indeed show that, yes, God had said through Cyrus that you're going to do this. So, number 3, anticipate great surprises from high places. This King Darius, the new king, said to Tattenai, the governor of Trans-Euphrates, which is what they considered where Jerusalem was, stay away from there. Do not interfere with the work on this temple of God. Let them rebuild this house of God. Moreover, I hereby decree what you are to do in the construction. The expenses of these men are to be fully paid from the revenues of Trans-Euphrates so that the work will not stop. So finally they were vindicated. They got what they were looking for, and he told the governor, hey, use your money, use your funds to help them build that building. I think of the bell curve of our church life here, and I shared with you a little bit last weekend about my personal call to ministry at PAUMC. and how one indication for me that was very clear was when this guy from California said, think back to where you were in junior high. That's where you ought to be. Bingo, here I am. I'm thinking back to the fall of 2011 when we were about to become a multi-campus church. And in 2011 is when I said, I really went out on a limb. I had no idea what I was talking about. A year from now, we're going to have another location. Where's that going to be? And some of you remember that. And some of you were with me in, I think, February that winter of 2012 when we went out on a road trip, 8 of us, in a Ford Explorer. And we drove around Big Flats and Horseheads, and we checked out this place and that place, and nothing seemed to be working. And then I got home that day, and I looked at my email, and somebody that morning early on had sent me this woman's no longer in our church, but she sent me a link to a Regal Cinemas thing that said, hey, Regal is welcoming church communities to come and use their facilities. And so I took that as well. Maybe that's a sign. And I went up to Regal that week at the mall and talked to the first person, the kind of the manager that was on duty. I don't know anything about that. But a guy in the background, I don't remember his name, said, well, come over here. And he showed me they had a little flyer on their bulletin board about how Regal was indeed welcoming new church communities in their facilities. And I followed up with that guy. The guy was in Chicago. I talked on the phone. We kind of dilly-dallied and wondered, well, should we do it or shouldn't we do it? Until the guy called me on a Wednesday when we were having our worship planning. I get this call from this guy in Chicago. Hey, by the way, there's this church from Corning area. Is Corning near you? Oh, yeah, I thought so. Well, they're looking at Regal Cinema for having a church there. So guess what that did? That kind of burned a fire under me. So I guess if we're going to do it, we better do it. And we agreed to go forward with that. And that served our purposes with our first campus for these 6 years. And I shared with you last week how that seems to be drying up now. There's another bell curve. You know, the beauty of these bell curves is one goes up, and you don't wait till it dies and subsides completely, but you allow the Lord to raise another bell curve and another so that you're staying on a higher plateau. You don't just accept that I'm going to go up and then we're going to go down. So our hope is to continue. This campaign is an effort we think God is leading us to raise another bell curve. Does that make sense? So we did that, and we had no idea how we were going to pay for it still. We said, okay, Regal, we'll go with you. And then in that same springtime, where's the money going to come from? It was then that I heard that our conference was interested in starting New Faith Communities. And we were there just at the right time. We didn't know what we were doing, but they gave us like $70,000 to start at the mall, mostly because they wanted the first one to work. They wanted us to succeed as much as we wanted to succeed. And we had a plan, and they were ready to honor that, kind of like the King Darius told Tatanai, hey, you help pay for this. It was like the Lord used the conference to provide for us, and we walked right into that. You know, we were the first. Now there's over 100 New Faith communities in our conference. I'm blessed that in this coming February, I get to go off and help lead Launchpad again. Launchpad is encouraging New Faith communities. For 4 years now, they've asked me to kind of encourage people to start New Faith communities. You can be proud of the way God has used us to be spiritual adventure takers, spiritual entrepreneurs, if you will. Now, as things are drying up at the mall, it seems, and at Regal, Linda and I were riding to Elmira one day from Watkins, and we're going down Miracle Mile, and it was Linda that said to me, hey, what about Ponderosa? That's empty. I wonder if that could be a location, you know? And that just kind of went on the back burner for a while. And then I got together with my friend Dan. Some of you know who Dan is. And he said, well, he really wanted us to stay at the mall, but if you're not going to stay there, let me call my brother Ron. And he picks up his phone, calls Ron. Ron, this is Pastor Bill. He wants to talk to you about Ponderosa. And so one thing led to another. And we got the keys this week, folks. For Ponderosa, we actually changed the lock. So we have our own lock now there. And we're excited that this is another step forward. Now, our campaign is not just about moving to Ponderosa. That's a small portion of it. But we're all in this together and how God blesses us. I was reminded this week of a statement made by a famous missionary named Hudson Taylor. As I recall, Hudson Taylor was a missionary to China. He spent his entire life in China, but he said this: God's work done in God's way will never lack God's supply. Say that with me. God's work done in God's way will never lack God's supply. We have seen that to be true in our own experience. And when we take those risks and we step up to the next opportunity and we go through the phases that we're going to experience obstacles, we can remember. Another thing that Hudson Taylor said is God takes you from impossible to difficult to done. Impossible, difficult, done. And then I love Ezra chapter 6, verse 22. They celebrate. For 7 days they celebrated with joy the feast of unleavened bread, because the Lord had filled them with joy by changing the attitude of the king of Assyria, so that he assisted them in the work on the house of God, the God of Israel. Now I read that and I said, did Ezra screw up there? What's this king of Assyria? Assyria was hundreds of years before Ezra. What's he mean by that? And commentators help me understand that Assyria became Babylon, became Persia, but God worked. Doesn't matter. The people are pawns. These kings think they're important, but they're just part of God's plan. So when he says Assyria, I think he's including Babylon and Persia, and God took these people that were the enemies of Israel and used them for God's purpose and his people. And I believe that God can still do that today. Now, we started out by saying that opportunity was responding to God's knock, to appreciate that that's God knocking. I can't help but think of a verse I've mentioned many times before, Revelation 3:20. Jesus said, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If you hear me knocking and open the door, I will come into you and have fellowship with you and you with me." So the first knocking of opportunity is Jesus knocking at the door of your life. Maybe you're thinking about the times that you've succeeded and failed and you slipped back down that bell curve and never got to the overcoming part. Maybe that's because you've never responded to Jesus' knock at your life, at the door. I would encourage you to listen closely. If Jesus is knocking at the door of your life this day, make that your first opportunity that you accept. And if you do that, please let me know that. Put it on the back of that Let's Connect card. I decided to invite Jesus Christ into my life. So they celebrated for 7 days. Last weekend, the communion song was Thrive. And I asked if we could sing that again. What I loved, Sarah Height, at our Saturday night Pine City service, we finished the song, and the song at the very end repeats, it's very repetitive. 4 times it says, joy unspeakable, faith unsinkable, love unstoppable, anything is possible. And I'm going to be so bold as to get you to sing that with me. I'm listening to you right now, okay? Joy unspeakable, faith unsinkable, love unstoppable, anything is possible. One more time. Joy unspeakable, faith unsinkable, love unstoppable, anything is possible. Joy unspeakable. I said twice. Faith unsinkable, love unstoppable, anything is possible. Okay, I'll quit right there. Lord, we thank you that we have joy set before us, as Jesus did, when we take on those opportunities and we go past optimism to face the obstacles, to know that we can overcome through Jesus Christ. Thank you, God. Amen.